This episode is presented by Avalara.
Hi, it's Pat Dillon, CFO of Flock Freight, and I'm on the CFO Thought Leader podcast.
This is episode 902.
Number one, at an early stage startup, we had to get more rigid around our controls. So that meant we needed to find out what was going on through really great business partnering with the leaders. But we also had to limit who could sign on behalf of the company, who could be spending what. There's really a lot of process improvements that we put in place around T&E, around supplier purchases, et cetera. So I think the company did feel that. I do feel, though, that we have regular weekly company all hands, and we have town halls. And so I think over the past year, been increasingly more open about what we're sharing. And I think around our ARR growth, I think around our cash burn, I think the company has kind of seen that all of these efforts are really driving towards something. It's not that finance needs to be blockers. In fact, the mission statement on our team is not to be blockers. It's to empower the business. But we've got to have that fine balance of supporting the business and having really good fiscal control.
Hi, it's Jack. On today's show, we speak with Celeste Ackert, CFO of Fairmarkit. Of all the places a future CFO may have launched their finance career in the late 1990s, the printing division of RR Donnelley might not seem the obvious choice. However, it's important to note the late 1990s predates the wide deployment of EDGAR, the database system that would electronically automate the collection, validation, and acceptance of financial documents by the government's Securities and Exchange Commission. Hence, the printing division of marketing communications giant RR Donnelley became one of the country's largest hubs of activity surrounding the creation, printing, and submitting of financial documents. For Celeste Ackert, an eagle-eye project manager inside Donnelley's printing bullpen, the endless flow of financial documents served as a portal to observe future career possibilities. CFO Celeste Ackert explains how, and much more after this.
This episode is presented by Avalara. That's the sound of not worrying about sales tax compliance. Because when you automate it with Avalara, you don't have to worry about collecting sales tax or tracking who and what is tax exempt. With Avalara, you don't even have to worry about new tax laws and regulations. Avalara does it for you. If your business sells internationally, Avalara has you covered with cross-border tax compliance solutions. And when it comes time to file tax returns, Avalara automatically takes care of that too, giving you one less thing to worry about. Avalara has managed billions of sales for small, mid-size, and enterprise businesses, and seamlessly works with your current sales, e-commerce, and accounting platforms. Take the worry out of tax compliance with Avalara. Learn more at avalara.com. That's AVALARA.com.
Hello, we're speaking with Celeste Ackert, CFO of Fairmarkit. Celeste, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
So, Celeste, as always, we're going to ask you to look back. We're looking for those experiences that you believe helped shape your finance leadership chapter, helped you prepare to be a leader. What would those be to mind?
Sure. So there's maybe kind of three areas I'll cover. And the first is around working under pressure. I actually started my career working for RR Donnelley, was the largest printing company in the world. I worked for their financial printing division. And I worked in New York City. And financial printing, as some of you may be aware, serves financial institutions and banks, and it specializes in printing and filing financial and disclosure documents to the SEC. And back when I started, not to date myself, but EDGAR, which is the electronic filing system, was just ramping up, right? So it looked very different. If you can imagine, registration statements and documents that needed to be compiled, signed off, and filed had to be sent to the SEC offices in Washington, D.C. For time-sensitive deals, a deadline each afternoon in order to be flown and hand-couriered to the SEC. There was a deadline each afternoon. And the new technology at the time was to have documents electronically sent to our Washington, D.C. office, printed there and taken to the SEC. So I worked in operations, and any given day would just be pressure. Some documents and clients we've been working with over months and weeks. Others were new to us, and on higher profile deals, we had clients physically in-house. So we had bankers and lawyers in-house. So if you can imagine, you're taking phone calls. We had phone interceptors who were directing calls and taking messages. We had faxes flying off the machines. You'd have clients at the door. And I remember vividly, it was a half door. So the bottom was closed and the top was open, and you had clients, trying to get your attention and handing you things. So in the middle of all of this, there's just the pressure. There's active listening. There's taking instructions. There's communicating timelines and working on multiple deals at a time. And I think this is where I really learned the benefits of really strong expectation setting with all of the parties involved. So we managed multiple parts of the deal with various departments and sometimes outside vendors. And you had to really communicate sometimes bad news. Sometimes things were taking longer than they anticipated, and there were dependencies. So I loved being that hub. I loved working cross-functionally at the core, and I loved the fast pace. So the first is around operating under pressure and stress, and that really became ingrained in my day-to-day from the start of my career. The second is around FP&A excellence and the power of business partnering. So in the early 2000s, I made my way out to Silicon Valley, following the dot-com and the ups and downs. And another big change for me was actually moving into finance. In an operations role, the CFO took a chance on me and hired me into finance. And I had the opportunity to do FP&A. I initially didn't know what or how big of a thing FP&A was. I just was really excited because I knew I could marry my love for fast pace and operations and cross-functional collaboration to finance. So after a few FP&A roles, I had the great fortune of being hired into VMware. And I really had the opportunity to see FP&A excellence. I joined VMware about 3 years after the IPO in hyper-growth scale. And I would categorize this stage as they were in the process of heavily diversifying after creating and owning the virtualization market. So I was hired into finance. I was matrixed out to partner with the GM and his business unit to operationalize acquisitions and grow by both building and buying. And I think in those first 2 years there, we worked on like 7 acquisitions and 1 divestiture. It was massive. So while much of the company's core products was more established, the new products, the new SKUs, the new teams that I was working with were not. So in many ways, it felt like an emerging startup, super high growth company within a high growth company within VMware. So during my time there, I had the opportunity to do 3 different roles there in finance. The first was, working on the BU side and partnering with the GM and, being that matrixed out controller. The second was in a very similar role, but we supported our largest products and largest teams. So this was more about scale and how do you manage data center and CapEx and large offices and thousands of engineers. So it was a little bit of a different role. And in the third, I moved into sales finance and supported the channel. And VMware was heavy channel. So indirect selling teams, partnerships, partner incentives, et cetera. So when I look back on that, those years really gave me exposure into world-class FP&A and the opportunity to drive initiatives on a number of things. But my business partnering skills, I felt was my strong suit, right? Helping lead my team to best support this GM and leader. And I remember vividly, there was a time where planning meetings, I think we talk about visibility and exposure to the top leaders of the company. I'm incredibly grateful for those meetings where I was sitting in with the CEO or the COO, and we'd have these operating plan meetings to maybe tie off on top lines. So my leaders would present along with the CEO or the COO and sales leaders, and we do this fine dance of negotiating and interlocking on bookings commit and the different product lines. So tons of data, slides, competitive info that my team and I were able to help with was presented to inform and back up, our specific product plans for our GM. So while I sat in finance, the bond I had with my GM was amazingly strong. Lastly, this kind of last experience was around startup readiness. So the last point for me was moving to Sumo Logic and the opportunity to put all of these learnings together and apply them in a startup. So one of the execs GM that I just mentioned that I supported at VMware, he moved over to become the CEO of Sumo Logic. And I came over to Sumo Logic as the first FP&A hire, and I had the opportunity to scale the company from less than 20 million in ARR to IPO scale. So growing the FP&A team. They were dealing with a very lean team with an always seemingly impossible to-do list. It really taught me how to focus on the fires, figure out when to lean in, and perhaps more importantly, when not to lean in. So all of those pillars of FP&A needed to be covered. We've got corporate FP&A, business partnering, investor requests, board, et cetera. They all still needed to be covered as we grew. And the challenge was, how do we scale the FP&A team? Where do we put that next resource to make the most impact? So I also ended up owning sales commissions early on, and that was a big P&L and cash line item. Forecasting that, owning the elements of commissions design, partnering heavily with sales ops, of course. But how do we have plans that tie to company objectives? The process of commission statements with the reps was on my team. The analysis around commissions earned, payout and held, et cetera. So one really fun and rewarding challenge I can recall there was when we made the move from manual commissions management to a commission system. We had an awesome commissions manager on my team who handled like hundreds of commission statements manually on Excel. So while we could have continued to do this, the time was right to move and implement the system. So working closely with sales ops on a tool solution, and this project was a pretty hefty one with many stakeholders to convince this was the very right thing. So in a scaling startup, and when you're in the thick of it, it's really sometimes hard to see that taking a step back is necessary in order to step forward. So we had, for instance, we had many versions of comp plans, and this project forced us to standardize, right? So ultimately, that implementation was a success and a reminder in the fun of scaling. But these three experiences allowed me to marry the operational, financial, and strategic goals within many types of different organizations.
Excellent. Really nice overview for us. The sense I get is that you really, once you found your lane in FP&A, you found it very satisfying and you were able to build your career there. I just want to emphasize it was more than 5 years at VMware. It was more than 4 years at Sumo Logic, where you followed your CFO to. And of course, as a vice president of finance, shortly before you joined, you were there over 2 years before you entered the CFO suite. How's that for a quick summation of the FP&A lane?
It's perfect. Thank you, Jack.
What's interesting, I thought, just looking, and again, I'm just looking at LinkedIn bio, and I know these aren't bulletproof, but it seems like you did, you invested 6 years with Donnelley way back when. You could have gone on to more senior roles, but you didn't. You were willing to, and I think you did get a business degree before you get into the FP&A lane. But until you found that FP&A lane where you could grow, can you tell us what was going on at that time? Your mindset as far as career building. I just want to get in a good spot where I can demonstrate I enjoy this.
Sure. And, I did make the decision to go back and get my MBA while I was working at Donnelley in New York. And I think it was a really great decision. I think being equipped with the MBA and also, the nature of work at Donnelley in financial printing, I'm working on these S1 documents. I'm flipping through here and saying, you know what, perhaps maybe I want to see myself in a prospectus one day. So I think those two things really equipped me with some fire. I wasn't really sure how I was going to get there. And again, I did a few operations roles and then, kind of wound up in FP&A, and it turned out to be that right lane for me as I'm now in the CFO role.
Yeah, no question. And I do think there's a big career lesson here for others who, as you said, you got the fire by peering into these other businesses through their S1s and their documents. and understanding the opportunities that were outside of Donnelley, because I do think you no doubt would have taken on more senior roles there. But my point is that not everyone would be willing to take those sort of risks and do what you had to do.
No, you're not wrong. And it's an interesting data point because I remember when I started at Donnelley, there were actually five of us that started on the same day. And I'm pretty aware that at least two or three of those people are still at Donnelley in various roles, and they've made their entire career at Donnelley. And I think that's great and commendable. But for me, I just think I wanted something different, and I wasn't really sure how to get there. But you're right; it was a lot of starts, changes along the way to get to where I am today.
You also changed coasts, East Coast to West Coast. It's your lane becomes tech as well, at least from VMware to Sumo Logic. Was that a decision you made as well?
I think it was. I also think that, in some of the companies I was at, I was also at a hardware company. And so I think software really intrigued me. I really loved kind of the financial models of software and enterprise software. And then namely, at VMware, they were dabbling a little bit in some SaaS products, but most of the licenses at VMware when I was there, most of the monetization model was perpetual. But I really think SaaS and now consumption models and those monetization models really, really intrigued me. And of course, the financials behind that, right?
Well, we may have a few more career-related questions for you, but right now, let's find out about Fairmarkit. And we begin our business segment by just coming out and asking that question. Tell us about Fairmarkit. What does this company do, and what are its offerings?
Great. So at Fairmarkit, we are on a quest to revolutionize the way that all organizations buy and sell. Fairmarkit is an intelligent sourcing platform that enables organizations to more efficiently purchase the goods and services they need. By equipping procurement and supply chain teams with automation and data, we promote competitive bidding while reducing manual work within existing processes. So in this challenging macroeconomic climate, enterprises across all industries are faced with harsh realities. Cost savings, supply chain continuity are front and center as strategic priorities. We hear this repeatedly on earnings calls. CFOs, CPOs are looking for efficiencies. They're also looking to expand their global supplier ecosystems and perhaps hit some supplier diversity or other goals, or ESG, environmental, social, and governance goals, while mitigating risk and without incurring more unit costs. So we find that processes in the procurement world are outdated, cumbersome, and inefficient. And the Fairmarkit process is simpler and easier to use because it streamlines all sourcing through AI and data analytics-based recommendations. And as more sourcing inquiries are run, the platform makes intelligent recommendations, allowing companies to make more informed decisions about their spend. And we find that companies that diversify their supply chains are more agile, and they're able to respond to changing market conditions and ultimately capture more market share. And what I love is that overall, our customers on the platform have experienced over 11% cost savings on purchases through the platform and a 60% reduction in manual efforts.
Well, it looks like you arrived springtime of last year, and you soon were raising funds again, I guess. But can you maybe give us an abbreviated history of the company's capital structure?
Sure. Yes. And I think you're right. I've been at Fairmarkit. I arrived in the spring. The company during the pandemic had raised their Series B, and we were on a journey, excuse me, shortly after I started. It's an interesting fiscal calendar. Our fiscal calendar is May 1st to April 30th. So my first directives were around completing that fiscal year, finalizing next year's annual budget. And as soon as we locked that down, we made the proactive decision to go out and fundraise. And I think it was more about leveraging and maybe not raising capital before you need to.
Had you been involved in raising funds before, and was it, if not, was it what you expected? I imagine it was in some ways, but maybe not in others.
Sure. Yeah. And I think, prior to coming to Fairmarkit, I was a VP of finance at a company called Platform 9. And, at Platform 9, we were raising our Series D, and I had gone through the fundraising experience, but it was more in a round extension versus going out and finding new investors. And so it was a very different experience where, you're certainly shopping the company and talking about all the great things, but it was a very different experience. And I think the growth trajectory at Fairmarkit really allowed for us. We ended up actually oversubscribing our Series C round. So the process was arduous. It was months of effort, of course, just like many of our listeners can, I'm certainly relate to. But I think the end result was through really strong foundational things that the founders had set up, we were actually able to go and raise and be selective and have a lot of leverage about who we wanted to lead the round and who we wanted to, let into the round. And so we also had 100% participation from our existing investors as well.
Now, it's been about a year since you stepped into the role. Have you reorganized finance in some way? Have you made some key hires, perhaps? What would you share with us?
Yeah, great question. So, like I said, when I started, the company was really already on a fantastic journey, and the fabulous finance team had already done some tremendous things by the time I showed up. So the company was founded in 2017, so we're still relatively young. But when I showed up last spring, accounting was already moved in-house from outside. We had already moved from QuickBooks to NetSuite, and we had already actually completed our first audit. So clearly the fundamentals were in place. And where I saw my value most immediately was to overlay the FP&A and forecasting and planning lens on top of the accounting and control process. So we already had an annual budget. We were comparing to statically and monthly in the form of BVA, or budget versus actual. But I saw an opportunity to introduce and prioritize monthly reforecasting. So having just finished up my first fiscal year at Fairmarkit, and it was quite a year, our ability to maintain cash predictability each month was paramount. So having the confidence with predictability on both receipts coming in the door and cash out the door allowed the team and myself to maneuver the company and the board through the year with little to no surprises. And, this is really powerful. This brings up, a story that stuck with me from one of my earlier startups. I remember I was walking past one of my boss's office, who was a VP of finance at the time. And I was, after playing foosball or video games or whatever it was at the startup, and he was sitting in his office with his hands just on his forehead. So if you can imagine, he's not looking at his computer. He's got his hands on his forehead and his head down. And I was just like, wow, what's wrong with him? This place is fun. It's amazing. And it happened a few times. I'd walk by and he'd have kind of the same stance. And so I asked him about it, and we had a really, really good discussion about it. And, he was just telling me through the realization of daily cash in and cash out. It was very stressful. And, alas, things got better and our forecasting accuracy got better. And we knew those large cash ins and cash outs, they were known. So it was better. So as I grew in my career and became increasingly more accountable and responsible for cash, I understood what he was going through. And predictability solves this. So in our past year, I'd be lying if I didn't have my moments where my hands were in my head for a moment. But our increasing improvement on predictability has really helped there. And I have full confidence in the talent on the team that we have. So I think with these fundamentals in place, we've earned the respect with the board and the company on our predictability.
That achieving that predictability and revealing to the board and to the organization, where the company is and how it's performing. Did you change how you share the information? Do you share it more broadly, perhaps, than it had been shared? Did you create new dashboards for maybe a certain part of the organization that you needed to educate better about certain numbers? I don't know. But can you share with us any changes you may have made in terms of how you educate the rest of the organization as to performance?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. I think there's maybe a couple of things I can share. So number one, at an early stage startup, we had to get more rigid around our controls. So that meant we needed to find out what was going on through really great business partnering with the leaders. But we also had to limit who could sign on behalf of the company, who could be spending what, right? So there's really a lot of process improvements that we put in place around T&E, around supplier purchases, et cetera. So I think the company did feel that. I do feel, though, that We have, regular weekly company all hands, and we have town halls. And so I think over, the past year, been increasingly more open about what we're sharing. And I think around our ARR growth, I think around our cash burn, I think the company has kind of seen that all of these efforts are really driving towards something. It's not that finance needs to be blockers. In fact, the mission statement on our team is not to be blockers. It's to empower the business. But we've got to have that fine balance of supporting the business and having really good fiscal control.
Wanted to ask you, as this company does grow, and just interesting, 2017, and of course you joined during the pandemic. I mean, half its life has been the pandemic. It's a remote company, is that right? Was it always, and was there a decision made along the way? Can you share with us the sort of the mindset as far as the talent model is concerned?
Yeah, and I think that's a great question. And to my understanding, it was heavily concentrated in Boston. Fairmarkit is headquartered in Boston. I am in the Bay Area. So I think at some point throughout the pandemic, the decision was made that, you know what, there's a lot of talent across the United States. Maybe we should just open it up and really optimize for the best talent that we can in the country and in the world. So today we are remote first. I would say we have hubs of people around the Boston area. We have another hub of people around New York City. We have a handful of us out here in the Bay Area, and everyone else is distributed around the world. And so what this really requires is a lot of communication, a lot of really good async and dependencies across the company, really good OKRs, really good measurements, really good cross-functional collaboration.
Is employee engagement something that concerns you, or there clearly were discussions around it as this type of model is adopted? As far as you being a finance leader is concerned, what would you have contributed to that discussion, or what would your concerns have been related to the outlying talent?
Yeah, and I think maybe for me, uniquely or not uniquely for organizations of our size, the people team aligns to me. And so this wasn't expected when I started, but shortly after I started, I inherited the people team. And so there's naturally now more intersections around how we view talent. The people team, our mission is all around how we do four things: how we attract talent, retain talent, develop talent, and value the talent that we have. And so the initiatives that we drive in the back office are really aligned to one of these four tracks. And given that the finance team is part of this broader team, these initiatives are measurable and they're tracked. So for instance, how we conduct our performance management in our case, we actually do a low touch, high frequency model, which is quarterly performance management. And that really informs our pay for performance strategy. So we actually just rolled out our first edition of our compensation philosophy, which drives our overarching framework for compensation, both cash and non-cash elements. We also have documented, promotion guidelines. We're refining our equity philosophy document, which is owned by our finance team, to more formally guide our option pool sizing and guidelines around initial and refresh grants. And so on a more day-to-day level, the finance team is involved and tied lock and step with the people team around recruiting processes, approvals, and ensuring that our headcount plans tie to our finance models. So I can't stress enough that full circle performance management is imperative to Fairmarkit success, certainly in this remote first model.
That compensation discussion, one would imagine that's a pretty broad discussion, meaning leaders from across the company in some way contributed or wanted to understand better how such a model would work. I don't know. How did you build consensus around that?
Yeah, and it was a few iterations. And I think the interesting dynamic too, when we look at kind of the economy coming out of the pandemic is, company benchmarks. We rely on benchmark data. We've always been a data-driven company. So company benchmarks are a huge part of that equation. And those have really changed in the last 18 months, right? So we're really following those trends. But, depending on our leaders, whether I'm working with our engineering leads and, head of engineering, sales. And so really a lot of iterations in making sure that cross-functionally and also through different levels, and then on a worldwide basis, we have a document that serves, most of the principles we're going to do, more like the 80-20, the 90-10 rule. So a lot of iterations. And I think it's, putting something on paper, and then we can always iterate and adjust and be agile as the company grows and scales.
Thank you for that. I do want to touch on FP&A with you, just given your background and having built your career so steadily in that lane. Want to understand this company, perhaps not the wealth of resources as some of the ones you built your career in, and I wonder if you would put a bigger priority on building an FP&A team. I can't imagine you have too many people to wear that hat, and in fact, you probably wear it. But do you, given the opportunity, do you look at it differently? I mean, I think you told us that most of the finance function is now in-house. And I'm just curious how you made certain decisions, and what was your FP&A? What do you have in mind for FP&A?
Right. And let me just start with like one quality that I think maybe a misnomer in my head was I always attributed to FP&A, which is analytical curiosity. But I would actually say that analytical curiosity is a mindset that is certainly needed. It's a needed attribute at a startup of our size, where we have the same back office functions to cover as a larger company, but with fewer resources, to your point, and more junior processes. So this incessant quest for what does this mean, or why is this like this, can really be a game changer in all functions, right? And so I think this can also translate itself into competencies outside of company knowledge. It can be around the competitive landscape or industry best practices. So I actually have one rockstar FP&A resource that we just recently hired, and she's experienced. She's made all the difference in the world. So she handles everything from budgeting, reporting, and planning. And while she's still ramping up, of course, here to help out, but that makes all the difference in the world. So this analytical curiosity was always that attribute that I looked for. And I think it's applying that to all of the finance roles that we have at the company. Early on as an analyst, one can expect to be comfortable with the same data sets, the same processes, the same reports and slides. Maybe you could take screenshots and put it on a slide, and you'd learn the foundations of maintaining checks, and your data was good. And that's your brand when you sent off, a file. But as you progress, what really set talent apart, in my view, was the ability to take this analysis, tie it to this larger piece over there. You begin to connect the dots. You become comfortable with more data sets. You're massaging and scrubbing this data to match it up. And these foundational checks that maybe you've learned, that's a given at this point. So really what this comes down to is that same screenshot that you used to copy when you were an analyst. Now you copy that, but you're really actioning and recommending along with the actual finding and the analysis. So this is really when I've seen talent differentiate themselves from the pack. And so it's when you go through a project and you notice that there's a new account that's showing up in the chart of accounts that wasn't there before, or they noticed this new SKU and it wasn't there. Where should it be classified, right? So those kinds of findings across the finance organization can help point out gaps in month end or other processes. And the dangers of not flagging these can be really dangerous and lead to rework later. So it's funny because sometimes we run into these things where you pick up a rock, and underneath this rock, there's some creepy crawly things in there. So sometimes you can note what you saw, you put it back down, maybe you'll get to it later. But sometimes you really need to dig in and figure out, what's under this rock. So I think this can attribute to all facets of industry knowledge, financial knowledge. But, one story I'll share here, I can recall at one of my earlier days at one of my startups. I remember having an hour or two outside of meetings. I could put on my headphones and really just crank on a model. I was really happy listening to music and just rocking it out. And a member of my team was sitting next to me. She also had her headphones on. And a coworker came over to us and asked what I was listening to. And I'm like, oh, I'm listening to Red Hot Chili Peppers or whatever it was I was listening to. And they asked my teammate, and she said, oh, I'm listening to, Splunk's earnings call. And it was a humble reminder that, high potential talent doesn't like to wait or ask for opportunities to dig in and go the extra mile. So it's really around that analytical curiosity that I think can apply to all roles, really.
Great. I love the story. Thank you for that. We're going to jump to our finance strategic moment question. This is where, again, we ask this question. every episode. We're wondering during the course of your career if you could share a moment of insight that you experienced because of your unique lines of sight into the business. You saw a risk, you saw an opportunity, you responded to it. Anything come to mind when we ask for a finance strategic moment?
Yeah, I would label this one as a really unexpected opportunity to add incredible value and insight. So, a year or two into my journey at Sumo Logic, we ended up creating some really powerful customer contribution margin analysis. And so, to frame this up, at the time, we had chosen an FP&A tool to implement and move from reporting and planning on Google Sheets and Excel. We held things pretty centrally. We had the intention of opening things up with key business partners and budget owners as we scaled, but we ended up choosing more of a planning platform that we could integrate and marry different data sources. So from NetSuite, we had our GL data, our CRM data, Salesforce, we had bookings data and pipeline data. Our ATS system, we had our recruiting data, and we had our HRS and payroll system. So all of this in one place was incredibly powerful. For instance, we could look at specific sales teams or regions. We could understand the fully loaded costs of that team, and we could compare that to their sales or pipeline, et cetera, all in the same dashboard. We could also do scenario planning on hiring and recs in specific regions and teams via different sourcing channels, whether they were internal, external, referral, et cetera. So where the aha moment came was on how can we more broadly share this powerful data. And my team had really started digging into kind of the company's unit costs. And being a big data company, Sumo Logic, there was considerable cost of sale along with that, and primarily AWS costs. So we dug into the AWS data for a number of reasons. We needed to better understand and break out production versus engineering costs. There was different costs per AWS hosting region. So we needed to be all over this in order to forecast accurately. So similar to how we married bookings and sales data with payroll and other costs, we planned out how we could take our thousands of customers and create a form of contribution margin by customer. And we showed and displayed this using a single common unit cost. We had the contracted amount that customers paid us. We knew which AWS region the data was hosted. We could estimate and allocate that cost. So we could show which customers were profitable and dilutive. And it was a dashboard. So you could search and pull up the customer individually. You could look at things in cohorts, and you could really understand the contracted economics. So I remember this project being one of those from design inception that you just wanted to stay late at work, map it out on a whiteboard. And there was so much excitement for myself and the team to contribute to this. And I recall our execs, CRO, all had access, and they used this data regularly for multiple purposes. So I would categorize that as kind of this awesome moment that I have to lead back into.
From episode 862, this is 1 Minute with Patrick McClymondt, CFO of Haggerty.
What I've asked the FP&A team to do is let's dive in deeply on cost to acquire and then also cost to serve, right? And there's so many different ways to think about this and how deep into the P&L you go and how do you think about allocations and all that good stuff. There can be lots of different interpretations. The key is, well, let's just agree on one version of the truth. Let's do the work, lay it all out, push and prod on each other, make sure that we all get to a place where we say, okay, maybe it's not perfect, but this is our representation of our unit economics. So that's the big push with the team. Work with the business units. Let's get to some version of truth on this. And if we can get there, then it just makes all the decision making that much easier.
We want to jump to our mentoring round where I'm going to ask you to look back again. And we talked about how you arrived there in the spring, roughly a year ago. And for those other finance leaders who are having their first month in the role, we're wondering if there was a piece of advice you could have given yourself. I know it was only 12 months ago, but what is that piece of advice you wish someone had given you?
Yeah, I think it's to continue to be authentic in yourself, right? And although that the challenges and questions coming your way may seem new, you continue to utilize the resources around you, right? Whether that's tools that you've amassed in your briefcase over your decades of experience, whether that's in your network, right? So I have CFOs that and finance leaders that I regularly ping about a number of issues, right? So it's use that resource around you and then continue to do the hard work and build a great team around you and empower them to be experts in their domains. And then probably the last piece of advice I would give myself is try to smile a little once in a while. I'm a very serious person, so need to do a little bit more smiling sometimes.
Interesting. Can I ask, was there a recruiter involved? How did you, or was it a contact?
There was a recruiter involved. And I think for this role and what I was looking for, I love the enterprise SaaS space as we talked about. But I think the main attribute for me was I really wanted to work around really good humans. Of course, any CFO role is going to be challenging and we're going to, spend hours together. So I was really looking for that really great connection with the leadership team and the founders. And my CEO, Kevin Frechette, is amazing. We have an amazing connection and relationship. It's incredibly supportive. And I love our daily interactions, whether they're solving problems, whether they're celebrating or whatever that is.
Great insight there for us. Thank you. Want to ask you to reflect a little on the personal side for us. And we're always looking to better understand how you set yourself apart in some way. Maybe colleagues would point out a personal habit that you have or a routine that you have, or maybe it's a family member who knows better that she's always done it that way. We're not really certain why, but something you're known for, a personal habit, a routine, something you do that sets you apart.
Yeah, I would say my habit's a little lesser known. I'm more of an introspective, private person, but I think the net answer for me has been consistently carving out time each morning to really gather my thoughts and prepare for the day. And so maybe earlier in my career, that was around an exercise routine, right? And then depending on the stage of my life or the week, that can really just mean, taking a quick walk or that third cup of coffee or, these days I'm a big Peloton fan, so I love to hop on the Peloton. But it's all about carving out just a few minutes about reflecting on what happened, what I need to take care of, and really planning for the day. That's where I'm really finding myself to be a better person to attack the challenges ahead of me in the day.
Celeste, would you have a business book? It doesn't have to be a business book, a book selection for us. It might be a book you escape with. It might be a business book. Anything you can recommend?
Yeah. So the book is called The Brand You, and it's 50 Ways to Transform Yourself. I was actually introduced to this book over 20 years ago. It's by Tom Peters. I have it on my desk. And what I love about this book is that it's not necessarily a finance book. It's not necessarily a leader's book. It's about how one can build their own brand, right? What have you done in the past to build your brand? And it's just an important lesson that I had the opportunity to learn earlier in my career, that everything about you, how you show up, your work, all of those things are you building your brand and what people think about you. So this book is all about what have you done in the past? What are you doing in the present? What will you do in the future? And it's really chunked out into 50 discrete pieces, which I like because I find myself coming back to the book time and time again. It's on my desk. But especially as aspiring leaders and finance leaders, we're undoubtedly great in our finance disciplines, but it's really about developing that well-rounded self and that brand that I think is really important.
Nice. Thank you for that. We are up to our final question where we ask you to look forward finally, and we're interested in your priorities as a CFO for the coming 12 months. What are your priorities?
I think there's 3 of them. So the first is continuing to maneuver the company through its strategic and operating goals, right? And I think that one is really the 2 main metrics there are around the trade-off of growth and burn. So it's really, that's number 1. Number 2 is keeping on top of our cash and treasury management through, the recent banking and interest rate moves and making sure, we're following best practices there. And the third is around continuing to develop and empower my team and our extended teams as we support the business and encourage them to continue to make space for growth and learning opportunities. So those are the 3 main things that are top of mind for me.
Celeste Ackert, thank you for joining us on CFO Thought Leader.
Thank you so much for having me, Jack. It was a pleasure.
Thought Leader listeners. As you have perhaps already heard or even seen, we're now featuring the career lessons and moments of strategic insight shared by our CFO guests as Thought Leader videos. You can now find these videos on our blog at cfothoughtleader.com and, of course, our newsletters, but also on LinkedIn. If you haven't already, please go ahead and follow our CFO Thought Leader LinkedIn company page, and you'll be certain not to miss a single Thought Leader video debut. CFO Thought Leader, the #1 thought leadership platform exclusively for and by CFOs. As always, thank you for listening.